Welcome back. So, this is lecture 2 of our module 6. In lecture 1, we discussed about diglossia, which reflects the differential functional usage of two varieties of one language or multiple languages. So, one language might be high variety, another language can be low variety. Now, today we will look at another scenario, that is an outcome of language contact, languages coming into contact, and how this interacts with various social scenarios. So, we will talk about language maintenance and language shift. So, these are the topics that will be covered within this lecture: language maintenance, language shift. So, language shift has two sides, one side is maintenance, the other is shift. So, we will have to talk about both of them and different forces of assimilation leading to shift in language loyalty. And eventually, when we discuss language shift, we will also talk about the end of the spectrum, which is language death, but that is the continuum. So, we not mentioned it separately. So, to introduce the idea, language shift, maintenance, etc., are outcomes of language communities. When different languages, different communities, different types of events in the history, in the past, how they interact with each other. So, language contact is a scenario that is typically an outcome of various historical factors that we have already seen in the previous module. So, different social, political, economic and psychological factors are behind the language community's reaction to a language, one language or the other. So, with new generation of learners, grammar and lexicon of a speech community can be reconstituted. That happens all the time. So, in the normal scenario also, even when another language is not coming in contact, even in that case, with each passing generation, changes might happen. Changes will be visible in lexicon and eventually in grammar. So, if speakers effectively pass a language on to the next generation, the language will be maintained. That is the simplest way to understand what language maintenance means. So, in any given community, if the language of the community is passed on to the next generation, then it is a healthy language scenario, but when it is not, then language will be endangered. And this is the simple definition of language maintenance is this. Now, why, you might ask, why language will not be transferred? Languages actually may fail to transfer to the next generation for various reasons. One of them could be that speakers do not use them enough in the presence of the learners. Learners can be next generation, it can be anybody. So, if we are not using our own language adequately, then it will not be passed on, because children will not pick it up. So, it may also be because of the learners choose not to make use of it. And why do we not choose? For various reasons, again social reasons, historical, political reasons and so on. So, language endangerment as a result of which may typically imply a serious shift. So, when one community is not interested in maintaining their language and thereby they are not using it adequately in enough number of scenarios, as a result it is not getting passed on to the next generation, there will be a shift. So, and when there is a shift, the language from which you shifted will be facing endangerment. That is the crux of the matter. So, questions will be, how does a new language come to the scene? How does the new generation come to learn it? What determines when the result is language replacement? These are some ideas that we have to explore in this. So, a little bit of history there. The term language shift was first used by Uriel Weinreich all the way back in 1968 to denote the change from habitual use of one language to that of another. So, habitually, if you are using your L1 and then eventually either within a generation or across generations, you shift, you do not use the language anymore. This can even happen within one generation. Throughout your lifetime, depending on your where you live, where you work, this can also happen within one single person's lifetime, but more often than not it is more clearly visible across generations. So, when you have shifted your habitual use of one language changes to another, that is how it was defined. So, the term maintenance and shift were consolidated in an article by Fishman in 1964. So, language maintenance is the continuing use of a language in the face of competition from a regionally or socially more powerful language. So, when there is no competition, we do not talk about maintenance. Of course, there is no other language to compete with, you will be maintaining your own language, that is not even a question. But when we talk about maintenance only when you, that means there is an effort. We remember we talked about language attitude, identity and all that. So, all of those factors come in play when you are facing another language which might be more dominant or trying to be more dominant. In those scenarios, if you are still maintaining your language, that is when we talk about language maintenance. So, as a result, language shift is the opposite. So, when when you replace the use of one language by another as a primary means of communication and socialization within a community, that is when language shift occurs. So, extreme case of this shift will be language death. So, it does nothing happens overnight, right. So, languages, let us say two or three languages or at least 2 languages come in contact. One language comes as an outside language, like take the case of India for example, English came in through colonization. So, English was overnight imposed as the official language. So, it was the higher variety. So, over a period of time, because English was the official language, the local varieties which enjoyed the high variety status or the official language status lost it immediately. So, over a period of time, the people shifted their loyalty from their mother tongue to English in more than one domain, not only in administrative areas, but eventually many other. And that is something that you can see even today many in many, at least in the urban scenario, that is the case. So, that is a case of language shift. But when the shift is so complete, you are not, you do not anymore use, today you see many mother tongue speakers use English for a majority of the domains. So, even in the family domain, some people do use English a lot, given various other factors. However, if you have not stopped using your language, your mother tongue completely, it is still there. But once you have stopped using that language, then that something happens, that is called language death. That is the other extreme of language change. So, shifting of loyalty and gradually completely when you stop using the mother tongue, that is when language death happens. So, studies of language maintenance, there are lots of many important studies, but some of them are the landmark ones are these. Similarly, there are many important studies on language shift. So, Nancy Dorian's case study of the demise of Gaelic, Susan Gall's study of the shift from Hungarian to German, and so on and so forth. These are some of the older and landmark studies in this topic. So, now let us look at language maintenance in more detail. So, when normal transmission of a language to children is disrupted, they are exposed to some other language. So, reasons of demand and supply is one that has been discussed in the literature. So, for example, when language acquisition within the domain of acquisition, when there is a language change in language demand. So, you need to use English for higher education, you need to learn English for job opportunities, you need to learn English for networking with the more powerful people, and so on and so forth. So, there can be various social factors, there can be many motivators that makes you change. So, the initiative may come from the learners or it may come from others, but either way it might be, it has to be there. For example, in the colonial practice of imposing a new language, that was the scenario. Thus, the supply of traditional language is then constricted. So, in the need for language maintenance arises when the language is in a situation where it is expected to be endangered. When a foreign language or an outside language is imposed, in those cases the mother tongue or the L1, the local language might face endangerment. So, this is how Fishman talked about it. It is difficult to characterize language maintenance since its practical content depends crucially on the kind of threat. So, what kind of threat are you foreseeing, on the basis of which language maintenance needs to be understood. So, arrival of immigrants to the USA from the 18th to 20th centuries created a natural laboratory for studying language survival. Many studies exist that looked at how much whether their language survived, whether in face of English, they were coming into an English speaking country, and what kind of dynamics were played out, all that has been studied. So, the factors that they identified, those studies identified, were early settlement, socio-cultural isolation, community structure, absolute numbers, numbers as in the number of speakers, the community, how big the community is, outside pressure to conform, and prior experience in language defense. All of these factors will play a very crucial role in either maintaining or shifting your loyalty. So, depending on if the number, for example, if the number of speakers are very less. So, there is a group of, let us say 100 people who have migrated together, one big group has moved to the US, and then because English is the dominant language now, 100 people may not be able to maintain the use of their language, whichever, let us say just call it L1. That L1's maintenance might be very difficult, because there is a pressure to conform to the social norms, speak in English. In those cases, it might be difficult to maintain. So, do they maintain, do they not maintain? These are the things that are studied within the larger idea of language maintenance. But often these factors are, they interact with each other, the attitude, the prestige factor, whether you want to keep your identity intact. So, the same scenario might work out differently for different communities. Let us say community 1 wants to assimilate in the local language and culture more readily. So, they might completely shift their loyalty from their L1 to completely to L2, they do not speak their L1 anymore. So, that they may not maintain. And this is more possible, the studies find out that this is more common with those groups who are phylogenetically similar to the dominant community. But in case of those communities who anyway stand out as different, they might double down on the identity marker of their language, and they might maintain their language more seriously. So, this kind of scenarios and this kind of decisive factor is a degree of morale and the social will of the group, within the group, how much, what is the motivation for maintaining, is there a motivation for maintaining, and so on. So, these are important factors that have been looked at within the study of language maintenance. So, there are these generalizations about language maintenance that have been talked about. One is timing, the other is effective means, and the third is long term realism. So, timing is very crucial. What happens is that adults often underestimate the threat to their language, because they focus on usage among peers and elders. So, sometimes they miss the changes in the younger generation's linguistic behavior and loyalties. This is one generalization that has been made about language maintenance, because what happens, adults do not always pay close attention to the way their younger generation's language is changing, the way they incorporate new words, and slowly but steadily children are shifting their loyalty. They prefer to speak in the other language, a more dominant language or more powerful language. So, those things if the adults in the community miss, then it will be difficult to maintain the language. So, awareness of language maintenance problems typically tend to arise when it is already too late, when the threat is upon you, that is when you notice, but that is what is timing. So, before time, within time, if you notice, then language will be maintained. If you do not, then there will be a shift that will happen. Effective means, so successful maintenance requires a dynamic and interactive approach. Communities must acknowledge the presence, the attraction, and the practical utility of other languages rather than denying them. You cannot simply say do not shift to another language. There has to be a dialogue, there has to be a lot of discussion about how the second language is, what are the utilities of language 1, and compare them and understand them. So, and then thereby you can create some effective means to maintain the language, and this will not be, there is no universal rule as to apart from of course, the will, political and social will, but every situation is distinct, and as a result effective means might differ from one community to another. Long term realism is another idea that has been put forward by scholars. So, language maintenance is a long term struggle, often it spans generations as the first point. So, when we notice it only when sufficient change has already happened, already taken place. So, for example, many studies have looked at the, for example, as seen in the case of British Isles by English and its Celtic neighbours Welsh and Gaelic. Welsh and Gaelic has been studied extensively. So, you can look up some findings as to how this is a long term affair, how to maintain a language and what are the conditions and how long it takes for any community to maintain or reclaim even. So, next let us move to language shift. Language shift, as I said in the beginning, when a community who share a native language abandon it, and collectively shift to speaking another language, that is when language shift happens. So, whenever two cultures, population with different languages come in contact, intense contact, shift is always a possibility. Now, you mix this with the idea of power, the hierarchy, the political will and so on and so forth, shift is more often than not a possibility. If another that is always a hierarchy in any social scenario, there are two languages, there will be a hierarchy in terms of which is more powerful. So, in that case the people shift from less powerful to the most powerful or more powerful language, that is always the case. But there are exceptions when the people from the more powerful may shift to the less powerful, that is also possible. So, the primary driving force behind language shift is basically language contact. So, people and their languages need to come in contact, there will be a hierarchy in the society and which will drive language shift. So, as a result, the primary reason for language shift is multilingualism. It is always, language shift is always preceded by bilingualism or multilingualism. So, how do you know there is a shift happening? When we move from language choice by audience to language choice by context, that is when you can safely say a shift is in process, it is happening. What is language choice by audience? In a multilingual setup, languages, the language that you use in a conversation, often you can change the language depending on who you are talking to. So, if you are there are two people and both of you share the native language, then there is no problem in maintaining the same language. But a third person appears and you have to accommodate the third person in the conversation, then you might shift to a change, a language that all of you share. That is a case that is quite common in multilingual societies, and this is called language choice by audience. This is fine, in this case it is still okay. But when you shift a language, you change your language or you code switch to a language, another language by context. So, when there are certain contexts which requires you to use another language for which you cannot use your mother tongue, is a good indicator that language shift is happening, because you are not able to use your mother tongue, your L1 in certain domains. For example, official domain, you are in any kind of highbrow discussion, if you are not able to do in your mother tongue and then you are shifting, and gradually the those domains will increase in number and power. So, there will be a shift, this is a good indicator. So, when the situation changes such that they code switch in some contexts to all speakers, then shift appears to be inevitable, irrespective of the speakers, meaning even when the language is shared, even then shift is there because of the context, then that is a good sign of language shift becoming a reality. Second is of course, the attitude, both internal and external, that is understandable. So, it is reinforced, caused by contrasts in power, status, economic opportunity and so on. So, as a result of which your attitude to language 1 and language 2 will be different. So, language contact between two linguistic groups representing different social status and are at a different stage of advancement. So, one language might be identified with advanced knowledge and so on, the other language is not. So, feeling of cultural inferiority often will result in eventual loss of the language and culture in question. So, that is another situation where cultural assimilation happens. You feel inferior, the speakers feel inferior about their own language and they want to be seen as being part of the higher social group, then there will be shift. So, these are the causes to put it simply. So, for example, you have economic, demographic, institutional and status related questions. So, economic is understandable when one language has more economic opportunities. For example, English is always a good example in India. English offers you more opportunities for economic growth and prosperity, more job prospects, more various kinds of opportunities are there. So, naturally English will be preferred. So, that is the economic aspect of it. Demographic, again the number of speakers. So, fewer speakers increases risk of language extinction, but small communities like for example, one community called Beso in Ethiopia have persisted long term. Segregation and concentrated communities enhance language maintenance. Though largely speaking, in terms of demographic details, then if your number is less, if the speakers are less for a community, chances of them shifting to another language is very high. However, there have been studies that highlight the fact that some cases where communities are small, but even then they have because they are segregated and concentrated. So, they remain a very tight knit community. In those cases language maintenance has been seen, but not shift. Institutional support is very important, So, the use of minority language in various domains. For example, in India we have 3 language formula, and now of course, the government encourages much more than 3 languages. So, every child is encouraged, every state is encouraged to use all the local languages in the primary education level at least, so that people can maintain their language or even learn their own language. So, that is called institutional support. So, when the government of the place supports the use of minority languages, small languages for various kinds of domains like education, administration and so on, then it is possible to maintain. The absence of such kind of helping hand will result in the decline of the language, that is possible. Status is easily understandable. Given the relative status of one language with respect to another, it will have a serious impact on the ultimate reality, whether you maintain the language or you do not maintain the language. Now, if we have already seen that in certain cases there are certain situations, scenarios where language shift is an inevitable possibility. Now, further down the spectrum you can even lose your language completely. So, language loss is a rather well known factor. There are some statistics that each very often, very like each moment there is one language getting lost somewhere in the world. The total number of languages in the world used to be much higher than it is today. So, language loss is a reality, language death is a reality. So much so that UNESCO actually came out with the classification of endangered languages some time back. So, they have these different different levels of endangerment, when you can call a language endangered or when it is potentially endangered and so on. So, potentially endangered language is when it is socially and economically disadvantaged under heavy pressure from a larger language and beginning to lose child speakers, that is when a language is potentially endangered. Then it becomes and then next stage is endangered languages. They have few or no child speakers. The youngest good speakers are young adults. So, there is hardly any child speaker, that is when it is endangered. That is when you can safely call a particular language to be endangered. Then is the seriously endangered language. Youngest good speakers are 50 or older. Then comes moribund languages, have only a handful of speakers left, mostly very old. This is the final stage before a language goes extinct. So, extinct language is when the language has no speakers left. So, this is how UNESCO's document gave a list of the distinguishing factor between which language is, how do you define what category a language belongs to. So, there are many case studies, for example, one particular language, Pacifica language shift. This study was carried out in 2002. So, this was carried out in New Zealand. It gave evidence of language shift from the Pacifica language to English. English is of course, the dominant language in New Zealand. So, this language speakers, they show that age grading such as using English to younger family members. When older members of the family or the group start using English to younger members, automatically you see a shift. So, fluency in the community languages is also age graded. All of the older generation and most of the middle age are fluent, but younger generations are not. So, thereby you can see a shift happening. So, age grading is a typical marker of intergenerational language shift towards the dominant language. Similarly, Maori is a case study. It actually came from Maori was revitalized. So, there has been a lot of studies on Maori. This is a Polynesian language spoken by the Maori people in New Zealand. So, the population is 500,000 language speakers, a few thousand fluent speakers. Many Maori people are monolingual in English. So, the reason for this language facing language shift and decline was because of the influx of the settlement by the Europeans. So, over a period of time there was a lot of struggle. Maoris have gone through a lot of struggle. So, initially when the settlement happened, when the Europeans came in, there were wars between the Maori and the British. So, Maori language was downgraded. So, their language, the use of the language was severely restricted, and some Maori leaders petitioned against the use of their own language in schools, because when a community is defeated, when you are subjugated, automatically over a period of time you internalize the stigma. You being a defeated race, it reflects in different ways. So, even the Maori leaders themselves said that they do not want to use the language anymore. By early 20th century, schools banned the use of Maori. Children were punished for speaking it. So, language shift spread from public domain to private ones, even homes. So, gradually the space shrunk. The use of Maori language was restricted more and more from public to private, and then even homes were not left untouched. So, even at home English got inside. So, Maori was not used much even at home. By mid 20th century, Maori migration to cities, of course, when they moved to cities, English is the only language to be spoken. So, this even more accelerated the shift. Then it stopped natural transmission for 2 generations. The language was by Fishman's stages, it was the lowest stage, that stage 7 and 8. Then there was a language movement by the Maoris. So, grassroots, this is called language nest model. We talked about language nest in another lecture, where intergenerational members were put together. So, the grandparents and the grandchildren were put in immersion schools, where the younger generation, the children will learn the language and how to use it in day to day life and for doing everyday chores. So, that is what language nest model is, and they use that model in order to revitalize the language, in order to restore the transmission from one generation to another. In 1987, Maori was declared an official language of New Zealand, and today in 2025, we know that Maori language and the Maori community have reclaimed a lot of their lost space and space of usage of their own language and their cultural practices. So, Maori Language Commission also were established to promote and regulate the language. The Treaty of Waitangi is very well known. This was done to actively protect and promote the Reo Maori. So, this is one such one case where a language has gone full circle. It used to be a dominant language, it has a rich cultural heritage as well, and then with the settlement of Europeans, the language declined, there was a shift, and eventually through the effort of the community, they have come full circle and revitalized the language. So, shifting to death is the extreme case, the complete disappearance of a language. most commonly typically it is it is visible in terms of a gradual death. So, over a period of time, over generations, a language gradually shifts and then eventually dies, that is possible. So, the reasons, but then immediate sudden death also happens. So, reason is the speech community is in physical danger, that is one possible due to catastrophic natural cause, that is when the sudden death happens. So, there is a huge natural calamity as a result of which a large number of population dies. So, the language also goes with them. Genocide, this is one of the most important reason for the death of many native American languages, because when the settlers came in there was confrontation and as a result lot of people. So, there were mass killing of the natives. So, genocide is another reason. So, direct confrontation, sometimes process of spreading disease also, that happened in many places wherever the settlers went. So, that is another way when because of mass death language also dies. Shift in lifestyle is another reason. See the shift away from the traditional way of life which is central to the identity of the group. So, in this case it will be a slow change rather than a rapid change into from shift to death. Marriage outside the community is another reason. So, some case studies have been there are many such many studies, but David Crystal's landmark book on language death, here he talks about he mentions few studies where they talk about language death in certain cases. So, one was in case of Cameroon, where the author, he quotes the author that as in how the language died, the death. So, in November 1996, I returned to the Mambila region with part of my agenda being to collect further data on Kasabe. So, the language here is Kasabe, spoken in Ethiopia, in Cameroon. So, Bogon however died on 5th November 1995, taking Kasabe with him. So, this is how many researchers who work on language documentation, language maintenance shift. This is one such scholar, his name is Bruce Connell. This is how he describes the death of the Kasabe language spoken in Cameroon. Another study that Crystal quotes is that of language Ubuk, this is a West Caucasian language. This the West Caucasian language died at daybreak October 8, 1992, when the last speaker, he gives a name, passed away. So, this is a case where another type of language death, where the person, the speaker, last speaker of a language dies, the language also dies. So, technically these languages died with the last speaker, but practically when there is only one speaker of a language in the community, the language as a tool of communication is anyway not there. So, technically he was the last speaker, but this was not anymore used for communication. So, even before you have only one or two speakers left, language is already dead. So, these are situations where language death also happens, but then why are we even including this as a discussion of a point of discussion? Should we bother? The researchers are, there are some ideas, some people that because of the attitude towards language, some group of people may say that we do not really need to bother. We should not, because this idea comes from the mythical story of the Tower of Babel, where multilingualism was portrayed as a result of God's wrath. God got angry and then thereby he cursed humans and everybody started speaking in different languages. So, multilingualism was a bad thing from the Judeo-Christian perspective. So, one predominant idea in support of monolingualism is that one language also would help unite people. So, there are multiple reasons as to why people think language death is not a big deal. One was of course the mythical understanding. The second is that if you have only one language, the world is ridden with conflicts. So, having too many languages might just add to the problem and not solve anything. So, having one language might be a good idea, but reality is not actually the true. Some examples are Cambodia, Rwanda, Burundi, etc. There is no peace even if there is no multilingual, not much of multilingualism. So, why bother? The main ideas put forward by researchers is that why we should be worried about language death and try and stop or at least document languages, dying languages are these. So, to understand the language faculty itself, we still do not, there are still so many unanswered questions about language as a faculty. So, that is one. Understand the general and specific cognitive processes at work, and then language loss also entails loss of cultural heritage. A language takes with itself, languages are storehouses of cultural information. So, once a language is gone, a particular perspective of looking at the world is also gone. That cultural storehouse is also gone. So, that is another perspective as to why languages need to be maintained. And then it bring to light either hitherto unknown relationships among different languages, thus shedding light on the prehistory of human evolution as well. So, these are some ideas that have been put forward by researchers in support of at least trying to help to stop the death of a language or at least document the languages. So, these are some of the reasons that have been put forward. So, there as a result of which you even can try to revitalize a language. So, often what happens that when the last speaker dies, you cannot do anything about revitalizing, but if you can, if the researchers can come to a scenario where it is still spoken by good enough number of speakers, then revitalization is possible. And this there are multiple methods that communities and governments have utilized. So, some of these are here. So, total immersion in schools, for example, literacy programs in the ethnic language, total immersion schools like the Maori did, like some other places also have immersion programs. So, that kind of a technique might help revitalize the language. Language policy of the government is very important as a contributing factor. Case in point is Hebrew. So, we have talked about Maori today, but Hebrew is another language that was revitalized. It remained as a language of the the texts. Hebrew of course has a rich history, but it was not used so much by the common people, and over a period of time Hebrew has been revitalized. Now, it is the language, official language of a country. So, Hebrew, Maori, Hawaiian, certain Mexican languages are good examples for understanding as to how language revitalization can be a reality. So, many of these examples are also there discussed by David Crystal. It's a good resource book for understanding the idea of language death and language revitalization. So, here we complete this lecture, lecture 2 of this module. In the next lecture, we will take up some more connected topics. Thank you.